Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. We have with us Jim Roberts. He's at Heritage. He works with the Index of Economic Freedom. We hear about that. It comes out every year. Of course, the United States falling in that index. Works on rule of law issues. Served in the Foreign Service. Has a master's degree from Yale. Very much engaged in the issues facing the global economy. Mr. Roberts, thank you for being on the Joe Miller Show.
Good to be with you, Joe.
So Greece, of course, we put up a few stories about what's going on there on restoringliberty.com. Of course, most recently, issues facing the nation marching toward default, at least according to the conventional media. Can you kind of give our listeners an update of what's going on in Greece? I understand it's a fluid situation.
I sure can. Thank you. Yes. Well, Greece, how the domes on Orthodox churches look like onions, and I think that that's a good analogy for Greece. There are a lot of layers to this onion. People can think back in their history books to the time of Harry Truman and post-World War II and the threat that Stalin and the Soviet Union posed to Europe and to especially the Balkan Peninsula. And Stalin agreed basically to let the West have Greece, and in return he kept the rest of the Balkans under his grip, like Serbia and places, and in the Warsaw Pact. So the 1948 entry of Greece and Turkey into NATO, and then kind of a political decision, very much supported by the United States, by the European leaders, to bring Greece into the European Union, really not as deserving as other countries were, and then even less deserving to go into the euro, which turned out to be a really tragic mistake in 2001. But it happened, and since it happened, it's extremely difficult to undo something like that after 14 years. And so we're seeing a country that doesn't really have, notwithstanding the fact that Greece is the birthplace of democracy, it's not really been a democratic country. It was under the rule of the Ottomans and the Turks and the Muslims for centuries. And that didn't develop the sorts of traditions of Western market-based democracy that we know in the United States and Western Europe. And it's been a very tricky situation politically and economically in Greece for a long time. And so there weren't the sorts of habits of financial fiscal prudence and accountability, the things that kind of the American values that we know are the foundation for our prosperity that we celebrate at the Heritage Foundation and that we look at through our Index of Economic Freedom. So you have a country that hasn't been disciplined, that even lied about its finances to get into the Eurozone in 2001, never did the budget and fiscal discipline that was expected of them, kept having to be bailed out with loans. And then after the 2008 meltdown and financial crisis, really went on the critical list. And then the IMF in 2010 broke its own rules to bail out big banks who were exposed in Greece, and broke rules that have been put in place by the George W. Bush administration to force debt restructuring then, which should have been done and wasn't. And somebody said today, an analyst in Brussels said that was the original sin that led to this crisis, the first bailout of Greece in 2010. So it didn't work. They had to bail them out again in 2012, and then they finally wrote down some of the loans, forced haircuts on some of the loan holders. But now it's still been a situation where now you have what's so-called austerity, trying to force the government to stop letting people retire at age 50 with pensions, and have a big bloated public sector and a very protected and self-dealing private sector in Greece, and try to force them to reform and hold this threat of the further defaults and not bailing them out over them, and it hasn't worked. And instead,
how much
the
money's
Greeks,
been...
the Greeks voted this far left party that's aligned with Vladimir Putin into power in January.
How much money has been pumped into Greece so far since the '08 crisis? Do you have any estimate of how much money?
Well, the three institutions, the International Monetary Fund, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank together put in 240 billion euros in the last 5 years. And then there have been other private loans and bilateral loans from other Eurozone countries, and some, domestic borrowing by the Greek government. So right now they owe more than 280 billion euros, and there's just no way that that's ever going to be paid. And so one of the issues here is that especially the Germans are playing hardball, and the French, this time, especially with this, hard left, reckless, Marxist-oriented government in power, and saying enough and no more, because they don't want to have people in Italy, which is, billions and billions and billions of dollars in debt, and Spain and Portugal, who've been, taking this tough love and these so-called austerity measures, and to look over at Greece that gets completely bailed out and off the hook without making these painful sacrifices. So there's a lot at stake here in this election, which some people say, was called in a hurry, and which is true, and on a very weird kind of ballot question that whether or not it's going to happen, it looks like anyway. And the question will be whether to vote to stay in the euro, stay in the West really, or to turn its back on the West and be open to the welcoming arms of Vladimir Putin.
And so if they turn their backs on the West, that means for sure no bailout. They're out of the euro. And, of course, all these Western interests that are owed $280 billion are going to be left in the lurch. Is that pretty much how it goes?
Well, that's really it, although, of course, like anything else with these extremely complicated, layers of onion situations, there'll be all kinds of twists and turns along that road. But it'll be a very significant point if the European Union, if the voters vote in favor of this far-left government and against, basically staying in the Eurozone, it'll be tough, especially tough for the Greek citizens who will lose their life savings. If they leave the euro and have to go back to the old drachma, a lot of their wealth will just vanish overnight. So
I was in Greece a couple of years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, and it was amazing to me. I mean, everywhere there's spray-painted symbols of anarchist movements. I mean, there's a huge amount of political instability that I could see, just this is anecdotal, of course, no survey or anything, but based upon what I saw while I was in country. What does the polling reflect, where this vote's going to go this weekend?
What's interesting is today people have been following the statements by this Greek finance minister who's an Australian economics professor and dual citizen Greek who's semi-Marxist, he calls himself. He started talking about how a vote against the European Union would be a vote in favor of staying in the euro, which basically means that this government is seeing internal polling numbers that indicate to them that people really do see a threat to their livelihoods and their way of life if they vote in favor of leaving the Eurozone, which would be a no vote on them. So the government is trying to spin this that you vote with us and we'll keep you in the euro, which is really probably a lie. I mean, it's hard to see how the powers that be in Brussels and Frankfurt would permit that. They would extract a very heavy penalty. But if people vote in favor of staying with the Eurozone, that probably means that this far-left government, which is elected with like 33% of the vote, would have to fall from power, and that's probably one of the end games here being pursued.
Mr. Roberts, we're going up against a hard break. I don't know whether we can keep you on for another segment to talk about the implications beyond Greece. Do you have time, or do you have to go?
Oh, I can stay with you.
All right, we'll keep Mr. Roberts on for one more segment from Heritage, talking about Greece, its implications internationally. Stay with us, The Joe Miller Show. Welcome back to the Joe Miller Show, KOAN Hot Talk, 1080 AM, 95.1 FM. This show is made possible by the McPherson Group Tax Defense Attorneys, BeatIRS.com, or 1-800-BEAT-IRS. That's B-E-A-T, IRS, defending freedom since 1978. We have Jim Roberts still with us. He's a research fellow for economic freedom and growth at Heritage. He's an expert on international economic affairs. Specifically, what's going on right now in Europe is what we've been talking about this last segment. There's a referendum coming up in Greece this weekend. It's an up or down vote on austerity measures, whether or not they stay, and the European Union could have grave implications for the world economy. Mr. Roberts, thank you for staying with us.
Happy to be with you, Joe.
And I also failed to mention you were actually with the State Department for 25 years, received some awards while there. So you've got quite a bit of foreign diplomatic experience. It's an area of expertise that obviously the Heritage saw in hiring you. How long have you been with Heritage now?
Actually, I've been with them 8 years now, so I've really enjoyed it. And, of course, I'm a lot freer to speak my conservative mind at Heritage than I was when working for the government. So,
love Senator Jim DeMint. He was on this program a couple of months ago. Obviously, under his leadership, the organization, of course, historically, even before, on the right track. But we're really impressed with, of course, what he's doing with the group and appreciate the conservative voice, the scholarly insights that we get. You guys are doing great work. Let's continue to talk about Greece. This referendum that's upcoming. Let's assume that it's a vote to get out of the union, to leave the austerity measures. At stake, $280 billion. What else is at stake?
Well, it would be essentially it would be untenable for Greece to stay in the Eurozone. So it's really Greece would in all likelihood, certainly stay in the European Union. After all, the United Kingdom doesn't use the euro, and they're in the European Union, although there's a big vote there coming up within the next couple of years. But there are several countries that have not adopted the euro that are in the European Union. So Greece would stay in that, but leaving the Eurozone would be very significant. If they were forced to go back to the old drachma, it would mean millions of different transactions and accounts and deposits and contracts that were denominated in euros and loans would all have to be redenominated. It would be a massive dislocation for the Greek economy. People would lose their life savings. It would be a very painful and sad development for Greece. And ultimately, of course, it would become a super cheap deal for tourists, at least for a while. And it could help. A lot of countries are able to, who have irresponsible fiscal policies or use inflation, and as we've seen, like in the case of Argentina and other irresponsible places, to adjust their economies to the consequences of their actions. And that's been kind of the straitjacket that Greece has been in, and the other countries in the southern tier also. But anyway, if the vote is in favor of this far left government and against accepting these austerity measures, then the European Central Bank and the European Commission and the Euros will have no choice but to force Greece to start taking the steps to force Greece out of the euro. And of course, they already missed a major payment to the International Monetary Fund due at midnight on June 30th of $1.73 billion, I think it was dollars. And there are a couple more very significant multi-billion-dollar payments that must be made in July. And if this government doesn't do those, that'll make it even tougher legally. And in terms of the protocols of these loans and the agreements with other member states, it would make it very difficult for Greece to stay in the euro. So it's a very consequential vote that's coming up.
Kind of on the practical side of it, news talked about how the bank accounts in Greece are largely frozen at this point and have been for several days. What's the story on that? Is that likely to continue?
It has been. That's been part of how the Europeans have been playing hardball with this Greek government. They have frozen the overnight kind of liquidity lines of credit that keep the Greek banks able to be open and to respond to people withdrawing money. And over $65 billion flowed out of Greece in the last few months in anticipation of this crisis. And that's why they closed the banks and limited withdrawals, I think, to 50 or 60 euros a day. And they've allowed some old age pensioners to go in who don't have debit cards to go into the banks on a limited basis to draw very small amounts in cash, because they only have, I think I read, only about 2 billion euros actually in cash in Greece right now. And so that liquidity line from the European Central Bank was what was frozen in an attempt to really play hardball and force the issue.
A number of economists out there, some kind of on the fringes, some not, who are suggesting that what happens in Greece could have grave consequences to the world economy. Is that really an exaggerated concern, or should people worldwide be watching Greece closely for potential adverse impacts to their interests?
Yeah, I don't think we're there yet. I mean, the economy of Greece is about 3% of the GDP of the whole European Union. It would have very secondary effects on the United States at this point, even if they left the euro. But it's the pattern of spending and irresponsibility and populism that's really the concern. I mean, we're seeing the same kind of thing, in Puerto Rico right now, with a government that borrowed $72 billion and raised taxes and has been demanding the federal minimum wage in an island that's not as competitive as the rest of the United States. And so there's some of these similar issues of kind of socialist government, populist government that, eventually, as Margaret Thatcher said, you run out of other people's money. And so that's happening in Greece. It's not necessarily happening in the rest of the world yet. But if these patterns continue, as I said, if Greece were to get bailed out, if they said no, and for some unbelievable reason the European Union said, if they voted for the far left government's position, and the European Union still said, well, we're so desperate, we don't want you to leave, and we don't want the Russians to have a foothold in the Balkan Peninsula, so we'll bail you out completely, then all the other countries that have billions of euros in debt, Italy is being one of the biggest, and Spain and Portugal and others, would say, well, what about us? We want ours. And then the European Union, the European Central Bank has already printed several hundred billion euros already in anticipation of this showdown, would then have to print maybe a couple trillion euros. And then you're really talking about real money, as they say, and that would definitely have an impact on the United States, because then you're back to kind of the 1920s, 1930s competitive valuations that deepened and caused the Great Depression. The dollar would be extremely powerful versus the euro. Exports from the United States would suffer, and that's when you could really start to see things falling apart. But we're a long way from that point.
So, of course, one of the major issues is realignment of Greece toward kind of the Russian sphere, and that could have dramatic implications for international stability, I mean, especially with the aggressive nature of the Putin regime. Do you see that as a real risk of the vote this weekend?
I do. I think that's what's lurking in the background. Putin has been supporting these extreme parties throughout Europe. He's been clearly supporting this far-left party in Greece. You now have reports today that now Greece is now the favored entry point for the millions of illegal immigrants who are trying to get into Western Europe. And if this Greek government leaves and gets friendlier with the Russians, and there's a long history there, including the shared kind of Orthodox Christian, beliefs of both Greece and Russia, a lot of sympathy between those two countries. So. Yeah, and it would have impact on the Middle East and on terrorism, also on ISIS. There's so much in the mix here; it's kind of hard to believe. It's a very good article in the Wall Street Journal today by Robert Kaplan, who's a very noted analyst of these issues, talking about some of these concerns.
Well, James Roberts, I appreciate your insights. Research Fellow for Economic Freedom and Growth at the Heritage. Help bring clarification to what's going on in Greece. We'll keep an eye on that election this weekend and the implications there, too. Thank you so much for staying with us on The Joe Miller Show.
Happy to be with you.
Stay with us. We'll be back after these messages. More great news after this.